All right, welcome back to On Air with Tony Sweet, Truth Be Told, where an experience becomes truth. I'm Tony Sweet. In our last hour, we talked with investigators, Ralph Ellis, about the elusive Bigfoot.
And I'm Walt Lusk, and here to remind you that the Conscious Life Expo sponsors are today's show. And you can get tickets for the 2015 experience at consciouslifeexpo.com. And you got to journey over to Adventures Unlimited Press and grab books and other products from your favorite guests from our show.
I'm Eddie Cotter. I'm the co-host of Truth Be Told. Now we invite you to travel from the mountains of North Carolina and the forest of the southeast part of Texas and travel all the way around the world to the land of the pharaohs. For the past 30 years, our next guest has journeyed where others simply do not dare to go.
Don't dare.
Ralph Ellis is an author, and he's researched biblical and Egyptian history and discovered a lot of outstanding new biblical and historical truths that are certainly leading edge. Now, one of the biggest cover-ups Mr. Ellis is going to share is the fact that the Israelites were originally Egyptians and that both King Solomon and King Jesus were also of, guess what, Egyptian heritage.
And Ralph Ellis's books include Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, Eden in Egypt, Cleopatra to Christ, Jesus, King of Edessa, and Solomon, Pharaoh of Egypt.
We know this show might be controversial or even challenge your beliefs, but in the end, we hope you have an open mind. We opens your mind to these things because we need new ways of thinking.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
we
with
do.
that said, we're going to introduce our guest, and we're so honored to have him on the show, the one and only Ralph Ellis. How you doing?
Good afternoon. Yes, very, very well, thank you. Nice to hear from you.
Well,
and
to be
good
on the
morning.
show.
Yeah, good morning for
Yeah,
you.
good morning over here. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, so it's a bit late.
Oh, Lord.
I know. Well, thank you for getting up. I know he's like, I just woke up. I'm like, for us, he did that for
Thank
us,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, Ralph. We appreciate it.
really appreciate it.
Well,
a
let's
lot.
just go ahead and get started because we have a long journey ahead of us, and we may have to have you back because you have a long history of research, 30 years, so we can't get it all in just a 40 minutes, 45 minutes we're going to have on the air. So let's get started.
We could do it in 6 hours. Maybe.
Right. But I grew up in the Midwest, and I grew up, with Christianity, and as I moved to California, and my mind gets, is opened up. And Eddie, who's a psyche, he's brought a lot of joy and to my life about just keeping my mind open to spirituality. And when I came across your books, amazing, because it really makes you think about Jesus and his background, because we just know what the Bible tells us, but yours goes a little bit more extensive.
Well, it's not. It's actually everything I write is actually straight from the original text. It's from the Bible. It's from Josephus. It's from all of the contemporary historians of the era. What I'm doing is actually just pointing out the little areas that maybe your local church would not discuss.
Right.
More than likely.
Things like, did this come from Egypt? Well, actually, we know that all of these texts did come from Egypt. I mean, if you just look at the standard Torah, the Old Testament, things like the what do we have? We have the Lord's Prayer comes from the Maxims of Annie. Psalm 104 is from the Hymn to the Arton, and various other books. So a lot of the information that is in the Torah actually comes straight out of Egyptian history. What else have we got? The Sermon on the Mount is from the Maxims of Annie. So when we have things like the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, a lot of the wisdom that is being given in that particular sermon is ancient Egyptian wisdom. It's just a straight copy of texts that have been around for 4,000 or 5,000 years.
Well, let's start with that. Let's start with that because I'm a big Ancestry.com person and I love doing family history. Let's go ahead and start with the lineage of Jesus Christ. Let's go back and find out where he came from, who was he related to, and how was he connected to the pharaohs of Egypt.
Well, and let me add this too, Ralph. I love your question, Tony. So if you would just sort of cap a little bit on what most people believe, where they believed Christ was born, and lived versus what you're
Right,
also
because-
encourages.
yeah, exactly.
So they can see
Well,
the
actually,
difference between
my
the two.
story doesn't change at all. This is the interesting thing about it. Both of my Old Testament amendments, as it were, and the New Testament, the new story I've drawn out of the New Testament, it doesn't change anything. So everything that you normally read and understand is pretty much the same. It's the sort of background to it that has changed. So, Jesus was born probably not necessarily in Judea. He was probably born in Syria, actually. But the difference is that, little things like why did the Persians come to his birth, the wise men who were the Magi, who are the Persian priesthood. Why were the Persians there? There is a Persian element within his ancestry. This is very complicated to do in 5 or 10 minutes.
Right,
But
Right.
he was a prince, he was a king. That's why he was called the Christ. The Christ simply means the anointed one, the king.
Okay.
So we know he was royal for a start. That's why he was called the King of the Jews. So what we're looking for is a king, a minor king, who was sort of in Judea, Syrio-Judea, who was of Persian extract, and who was also of Egyptian extract. Remember the New Testament, out of Egypt I have called my son. This is why he went to Egypt for his education. Because he
Yes,
was
he
of
did.
Egyptian extract as well. So we're looking for a minor royal who was, sort of half Persian, half Egyptian, but lived in Syrio-Judea. And it just so happens that there is a royal family of that nature. And they've been sort of largely deleted from history, and this is why we don't know too much about them. And they are, in Josephus, he calls them the Kings of Adiabene. Queen Helena is the most famous, and she was almost pretty much the Queen of Judea in the mid-1st century. She has the largest palace and the largest tomb in Judea. But again, her history has sort of been deleted from history. I mean, you go there. When I went to Israel, nobody seemed to know who Queen Helena was, and yet in the 1st century, she was the most famous monarch in that particular area. But my work extends on that because when I went to Syria, I discovered that the Syriac historians say that Queen Helena was actually the queen of Edessa. And Edessa is a small town. It used to be a large city, actually, but it's a small town in northern Syria, and it's now in Turkey. But it was very, very famous in the 1st century. And this was an independent monarchy who was half Persian, probably with Egyptian heritage, who lived in Syria, but moved to Judea, and they became the kings and queens of Judea, with the largest palace in Jerusalem. So here we have a monarchy that sort of mimics everything that the New Testament is saying about this minor monarch, Jesus himself, of course, who lived in Judea in the 1st century. And it just so happens that the name of this particular monarch, the son of Queen Helena, was called Esus. King Esus. And of course, this is the character who I'm saying actually became the biblical Jesus. And so it doesn't change the story at all, apart from the fact that the carpenter, the lowly carpenter, becomes a prince. He has the same name, he has the same family, he has the same heritage. Out of Egypt I have called my son, etc. It's just that he is rather more important in the 1st century than we tend to assume.
But quickly, how do you address, for example, in the New Testament, they have the lineage, so and so begot so and so who begot so and so, and there might even be something in the old, but now there is the new. In terms of that, are you able to correlate that?
Yes, because he comes back. He is descended from King Solomon, of course, which
yes.
I don't disagree with.
Okay.
But King Solomon happens to be an Egyptian, and that's another story entirely. We have this problem with the Solomon story, which is very, very similar to the Jesus story, of course, where all of these people are missing from the historical record. And this is what set me off on this journey in the first place, because you have these famous books, you know, that everybody has read and everybody follows, and yet all of the major characters from these books, whether it's, you know, Abraham and King David and Joseph and all the way through to Jesus, all of these characters are missing from the historical record.
Wow.
And that's a problem. You know, you've only got a couple of choices, really. Either the whole story is fabricated, or we're missing who these people are. You know, we in some senses, we're deliberately missing who these people really were. And I think that the second option is the real option. These people are real people, but we have missed who they are because we don't necessarily want to know who they are. For instance, Jesus being a prince and not a carpenter. It's the difference in class.
Yes.
That stops us seeing who this character is. And in terms of King David and King Solomon, it's who they are, again, stops us from seeing who they really were, because we have a problem with King David and King Solomon, is they are missing from the historical record. But when the archaeologists went to Judea, you know, Finkelstein and Silverman and people like this, and they've done the archaeology in the region, and they say that Judea was no more, Jerusalem was no more than a village in that particular era. So there was no united monarchy. It didn't exist. And that gives a problem for Judaism, because these are the big heroes of Judaism. You know, they were the most influential monarchs of that era. And Jerusalem did not exist in that era. So what's the solution? The solution is they did not live in Jerusalem at that time. What happened is again, a bit like the New Testament change in class and story. They did not live in Zion, which is Jerusalem.
Yes.
They lived in Zoan, which is Tanis in Egypt. So they were not Israelite monarchs. Well, they were Israelite monarchs, but they didn't live in Jerusalem at that time. They lived in Tanis. And it just so happens that Tanis has the same name as Jerusalem, of course. So this is where the sort of not the mistake, because it's a deliberate mistake, but this is where the change has come from.
Well, then, for example, not to jump ahead or change your story, but today Jerusalem's a pretty important place.
Yes, of course, but
for any number,
it didn't exist.
For any number of reasons.
It was actually Tanis.
Okay, and so how did the Jerusalem that we know of today in Israel become where it is? If you're saying, and I'm not doubting you, I'm just trying to connect the dots.
Because Tanis was the big area. So the United Monarchy lived in Tanis, and if we go to Tanis, we have an identical monarchy to the United Monarchy. So we have a monarch there who was known for the star and the city. The same as King David, of course, the city of David, the Star of David. And the king of Tanis was, his name was the Star and the City. That was his name. Pasibakahayanit is his official name in Egyptian. But his nickname in Egypt was Duad. And of course, the name of King David in the Torah is Duad. He has the same name. And, you know, little things like his daughter was called Makara Mutemhat. And, of course, the daughter of King David was called Makatemar. All of the characters fit. I mean, the whole scenario fits. But so they lived in Tanis, and that was their capital city. So the Temple of Solomon was in Tanis, and it's still there if you want to go and have a look at it. This is the interesting thing about this readjustment of what the Old Testament and New Testament are saying. These characters are real, and you can actually go there and see them. King David and King Solomon are in the Egyptian Museum at present. Their mummies are still there, and their sarcophagus. And they are, just as the United Monarchy says in the Torah, the richest and the most wealthy monarchs of that era. If you have a look at their sarcophagi, they are the wealthiest, richest sarcophagi ever in Egypt, apart from Tutankhamun. Actually, in some sense, better than Tutankhamun, because they're made of solid silver, and silver in Egypt was actually more valuable than gold.
Wow.
So they are the wealthiest burials ever
Oh.
within Egypt.
So, Ralph,
So these people were based in Tanis, which is Zoan, not Zion. And but what happened? How did they get to Jerusalem? Well, that came about because of Nebuchadnezzar. If you remember, Nebuchadnezzar came down and he destroyed not only Judea, but also northern Egypt, and took all of the people away into Babylonian captivity, if you remember.
Yes.
The Babylonian exile. But after they were rescued by Cyrus the Great, I think it was, if I remember correctly. About 40 years later, anyway, they were rescued. And the Israelites were allowed to go home. Half of them didn't, which is why Iraq was Jewish up until 1947. It was almost a Jewish nation, because most of them didn't actually want to go back, because they were doing quite well in Babylon. So all of Baghdad was substantially run by the Jewish people until 1947, when they were all kicked out. 500,000 were kicked out of Iraq at that time.
Wow.
But the rest of the people did go back. So we have the return of the people from Babylon. But they weren't allowed to go back to Egypt because Persia controlled Egypt at that time. So they went back to Jerusalem instead. So effectively, Jerusalem, as we know it now, the location now, was only really founded as a major capital city in about the 6th century BC. And that's why everyone thinks that that is the capital city of the Israelites. But it wasn't. The original capital city was actually Zoan, not Zion. And of course, in Hebrew, it's spelt in the same fashion. So that's the sort of readjustments I'm making to the original story. The original story is correct. It's just our interpretation of it. I mean, little things like, Mount Sinai. I mean, how can the Israelites lose their most important sacred mountain and nobody knows where it is? I mean, it's just not credible. I mean,
It's true.
I mean, the Israelites are the world's greatest chronographers. I mean, they have written about everything that's happened to their people for the last 3,000 years or more, and yet they lose their mountain. How do they do that? It's just impossible. But they haven't lost the mountain. We all know where it is, but they just don't want to admit where it is because it links them again to Egypt. And for many cultural and political reasons, they don't want to be linked to Egypt. It was much easier to sell a sob story of being oppressed by the Egyptians than to admit that you were Egyptians yourself. And actually, you were very, very powerful people in Egypt. King David and King Solomon, these are the two pharaohs of the United Monarchy, were the most powerful people in the world at that time. It's difficult to sell It's difficult to sell a sob story of being persecuted when you're actually the most powerful people in the world. And this is what's happened. Historically, Judaism has separated itself from Egypt, and they did the same with Mount Sinai. They separated it from its original location in Egypt. But it's pretty obvious what Mount Sinai is. We're looking for a sacred mountain that's on a desert, that's sharp, it's difficult to climb. It's the largest mountain in the region. It has a cave inside it, a sacred cave where God lives. So it's a mountain of God. And it has a black pavement at the base of it. Well, where is that mountain? Well, it's quite obvious. It's the Great Pyramid of Giza. And that's what they covered up. That's what they didn't want everyone to know, that they were not only living in Egypt, but they were the priests and the monarchs who were in control of the Giza Plateau. Because the Giza Plateau, of course, it wasn't a burial site at all. It was a cathedral complex. This was the greatest temple complex in the whole world at that time. And it was run by the Israelites. And that was their sacred mountain, because if you go to if you go to Giza, you will find that the Great Pyramid is on the edge of a desert. It's sharp. It's difficult to climb. It is the largest mountain in the region. It's the largest pyramid. It does have a cave inside it. We all know. We've probably all been there. It is a mountain of God. All of the pyramids were mountains of God. They had the eyes of Ra on the top of them. And of course, if you go to the eastern side of the Great Pyramid, you will find the great black basalt pavement. That's what the Bible is trying to describe when it describes this pavement at the bottom of Mount Sinai. It's the great black basalt pavement, which is on the eastern side of the Great Pyramid. And it's smooth as the night sky, just as the Old Testament says. So this is the history. It's the same history, but it's a slightly covered up history. It's a history that's been divorced from its original roots. And the same happened to the New Testament as well. It became divorced from its original roots. But the original story, I think, is actually more interesting than the manufactured story in many reasons.
Well, I want to jump to something, because Christianity itself, the creation of Christianity, you said, Saul created the Christian faith. I want to go into this a little more of, what was his purpose of actually creating the religion?
That is the really interesting story. This is when it becomes a really interesting, fundamental aspect of our Western political history.
Praise Jesus.
Bring it.
Preach it.
It's a history that has created the Western world, and it was all created by Saul and the Romans. You have to take the New Testament in context with what was happening at the time. It was part of the Roman Empire, so this is a Roman story. It's not a Judean story. All of this happened 30 years later than the New Testament seems to record. So this all happened in the AD 60s. And what happened is that Rome was in turmoil. They had a despotic emperor, Nero, who was on his last legs, who expired in 68 or whenever it was, AD 68. And the throne of Rome was empty, and it was open to whoever could take it. Now, the great oracle in Rome, and there is good reason for saying that all of this happened in the AD 60s, and the great oracle of Rome at that point is that the new emperor would be a star from the east. Now, who was born under the Eastern Star? It was Jesus.
Well, Jesus Christ, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So this was the star prophecy. The great prophecy of Rome is that the new emperor would be the star from the east. This was the star prophecy that was given by Josephus, remember, in his Jewish war. This star prophecy was given in Judea by Josephus, was given to Vespasian, who became the next emperor, because he said, you're in the east, therefore you're the star from the east, and so I'll give you the Judaic star prophecy. But of course, the Judaic star prophecy belonged to Jesus. He was the one who was born under the Eastern Star. And this is the great political machination that went on at this time. So the throne of Rome was empty. There were 4 emperors that went that made a bid for the throne of Rome. Actually 5, because Jesus was one of them. So we had the four emperors, the year of 4 emperors. And the final 2 who were battling it out in Judea for the throne of Rome were King Aesus and Vespasian. And this is real history. I'm not making this up. This is real history. So the king in Judea at the time, who was the son of Queen Helena that we've just been talking about, started a revolt in Judea, which is known as the Jewish Revolt. And this was the big battle that happened on the eastern fringes of the empire. But it wasn't a battle for Judea as people make out. They were not battling for the soul and the throne of Judea. This was a battle for the throne of Rome. And the 2 contestants were, well, the main contestant was King Aesus, who came from Edessa. This is why I say Jesus was the king of Edessa. And he was trying to take over Judea because the Roman East was the richest, wealthiest part of the Roman Empire. It was very influential. It's not like it is now, a sort of backwater of zero economic production. It was the richest part of the empire. So if you could control the Roman East, you could control virtually the whole empire. And the kings of Edessa already controlled Syria. So they controlled most of Syria already. And if they could take over Judea and what is now Jordan, that would be the whole of the Roman East. And they would be incredibly powerful. And they could easily take over Rome and become the next emperor of Rome. And the only person standing in the way of that was Vespasian, who was the army commander who was sent by Rome to try and put down this rebellion. And so the battle became King Esus versus Vespasian. And it happened to be that Vespasian won, of course, because he had the backing of Rome. He had 6 legions out there. And he won this particular battle. And that is why he took the star prophecy from King Esus, who he was battling in Judea. And he took the star prophecy and went back to Rome and became the next emperor. So this was actually a major, major eruption within the Roman Empire. And what Vespasian wanted, the Flavians they call them, these are the Flavian emperors, what the Flavians wanted was to quell all of this rebellion on the eastern borders. Judea had been always a hotbed of rebellion, and the Jews in particular. Because they would not subscribe, they would not be good Romans. The Jews would not eat with Romans, they wouldn't sleep with Romans, they wouldn't bathe with Romans, they wouldn't go to Roman temples, and they wouldn't honor the emperor as, the god of Rome, as it were. So they were not good Romans. And what Rome wanted, what the Flavian emperors wanted, was a new, I call it a simple Judaism, Judaism for Gentiles, a good Roman Judaism. So they wanted a Judaism that all Romans could be members of, so it wouldn't be so elitist, it wouldn't be so radical, it wouldn't cause problems on the eastern borders of the empire. And so they created, or rather, they got Josephus to create. So this is this is Josephus, Josephus Flavius, who was the premier historian of the first century in Judea. They got him to create a new form of Judaism, Judaism light, simple Judaism, and we call this Christianity, because it's a little known thing that within the New Testament, if you read the New Testament, Christianity, as we know it today, has nothing to do with the Church of Jesus whatsoever. Wow, completely.
Big surprise.
Well,
that's what the New Testament says if you actually read it.
Well, and if you're just
Christianity was set up by Saul, and Christianity was the enemy of Jesus. So he mocked Jesus all the time, and he called them the party of the circumcision. So they were complete enemies. And of course it was Saul that won this particular battle, and his new form of simple Judaism became Christianity. So what Christians are doing is they are following the religion of the enemy of Jesus.
Is that being Saul?
That's Saul. Saul was the enemy of Jesus. I mean, you've only got to read the epistles and Acts to see that.
And hold on one second, Ralph. If you're just tuning in to On Air with Tony Sweet, we're doing our Truth Be Told show. We're literally on Skype internationally with author Ralph Ellis, who's written the book Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, and many other books. He's absolutely educating us here. Right. We are thrilled to have you on the air, and Walt has a question.
A couple of things. Well, we know about the Saul, who was Paul, who obviously had his little epiphany right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, he
On
was
the road to Damascus.
tootling down the road to Damascus. Yes.
Yeah.
So you say that was contrived? Is that your contention? Saul, why are you persecuting me?
We have to again. We have to go back to fundamentals and ask that same old question that we've asked before. How can we lose the world's most famous person in the last 2,000 years?
Wow, that's so simple and powerful.
One other side question.
Who is Saul?
Yeah,
how can we lose the person who created Christianity?
Right.
Christianity, as I said, has got nothing to do with Jesus. He was a Nazarene. He was a Jew. He kept Mosaic law.
Yes.
It was nothing to do with Christianity. Christianity was created by Saul. Simple. So how do we lose the creator of Christianity in such a literate era when everything was written about, and Josephus Flavius never ever writes anything about Saul or even Jesus, come to that matter? All of these people have escaped the quills of the historians of the era. So how did we lose Saul?
Well, he was persecuted by the Romans eventually, was it? That's the story, right?
Well, that's the story, but we still lose him from. Saul does not exist in the historical records. So again, the question comes: how do we lose this guy?
Well,
we didn't lose him.
Yeah, it's fascinating. That'd be like
we
saying we lose the Constitution of the United States. It's like
we had a change of name. That's all that happened. So all we've got to do to find our dear old Saul is to look for his life story within the history of first century Judea. And there just so happens to be a person who has exactly the same life story as Saul, including both of them being sent to Rome in AD 62 on a prison ship going to Rome, which was shipwrecked, if you remember in the Book of Acts. It was shipwrecked, and they ended up on Malta, and then they were taken to Naples, and then on to Rome to go and see Nero.
Yeah, that's correct.
Well, so did Josephus. Josephus was on that ship, Josephus Flavius.
Good Lord.
Now, the problem then is how can we have these two characters with exactly the same life history at the same time, writing the same books? Both of these people were the premier authors of this era, remember? Saul was writing all of the biblical books, and Josephus was writing all of the historical books. They are the same person.
So you're saying he was a very prolific guy.
Yeah, he is probably the most influential person there has been in the last 3,000 years. Forget Jesus, forget Moses, forget all these other people. The most influential person for the Western Hemisphere was actually Saul Josephus.
Now, digressing real quick because I want to get this question real fast. You are saying that in terms of timing, when was Jesus Christ born?
Probably AD 14. We have several stories, of course. We have the 4 BC story, which is King Herod, but that's the wrong Herod. That's nothing to do with it. We have the AD 6 story, which is the taxation event under Quirinus.
Yes.
But it's quite possible that was actually the birth of John the Baptist, not Jesus.
Okay.
And then we have another story from Bishop Irenaeus, which is AD 14. And I think he's probably the AD 14. Well, now, the AD 30, big death, everything happening under Pontius Pilate, that was actually John the Baptist's death. And we know that Jesus was alive post this date, and we know that he was alive in the AD 60s and the Jewish revolt, because Jesus himself describes the siege of Jerusalem. In the New Testament, he describes how Jerusalem is surrounded by the Romans, etc. Now, they pass this off as being prophecy. Oh, he just prophesied it. But no, he actually describes the siege of Jerusalem in AD 70. So we know he was alive in AD 70. And there are many, many reasons. I've probably got about 15, 20 reasons why the New Testament events actually happened in AD 60 and 70, and they actually detail the events of the Jewish revolt. because Jesus was crucified alongside revolutionaries. So what revolution was this? What, Barabbas was supposed to be a revolutionary who would commit murder in the revolution.
Yes.
Which revolution was this? Well, this was the Jewish revolt. And we know it was the Jewish revolt because Josephus Flavius describes the crucifixion. So after the Jewish revolt, the leaders of the revolt, and remember the leader of the revolt is King Ezus, they were crucified. And there were 3 of them were crucified in the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem after the Jewish revolt. But a man comes along, a man called Josephus, and he sees the 3 people who were his previous colleagues being crucified, and he makes a petition to the governor for them to be taken down from the cross. 2 of the people who were being crucified died, but one of them survived. Familiar story?
Yes.
Right.
And the man who took them down from the cross was called Josephus. Josephus of Arimathea. But in reality, of course, this was Josephus Flavius. This was Josephus himself. So the man who took Jesus down from the cross was actually Josephus, St. Paul. So yeah, it's a complex little story,
to say the
but
least.
it's all there. It's all there in the historical record. So we overcome this problem that we've always had, this perennial problem, that everything is missing from the historical record. Suddenly, actually, all of these people are in the historical record because we know who King Ezus was. He was the king of Edessa, and he lived in Jerusalem, and he was the king of Jerusalem because he owned the largest palace and the largest tomb in Jerusalem. So was he not therefore the de facto king of Jerusalem? This is why he was called the king of the Jews, because King Ezus was a Jew, of course, as well. Not only that, they were Nazarene Jews, and of course Jesus is called the Nazarene.
Yes.
So suddenly it all begins to fit.
Well, so you're saying, then how do you explain the resurrection?
Because he survived the cross. Well, remember, the resurrection, there is a dual part to this. He survived the cross when he shouldn't have done. I mean, nobody survived being on the cross.
Yeah, absolutely.
In that era. But Josephus records that he did survive. One of the leaders of the revolt did survive being on the cross, which is very unusual in that era.
It was forecasted that none of bone in his body would be broken, and he didn't have any broken bones. Many of them died because they would break the legs.
Well, I'm not sure about that. He had a limp afterwards, apparently, and he was blind in one eye, and he had a dislocated shoulder, according to the Romans. So he was bloodied and bruised after it. But also, with this resurrection business, it's a very old tradition. I've died and I've been resurrected in exactly the same fashion. It's called a 3rd degree raising. A Masonic 3rd degree raising. If you look at the raising of Lazarus,
yes,
because if resurrection is how you become a god, then everyone should be worshipping Lazarus, not Jesus.
Technically,
because Lazarus was raised from the dead before Jesus was.
He was.
So we should be worshipping Lazarus. But this is not what it was all about. This was a 3rd degree raising. If you look at the raising of Lazarus, with Lazarus coming out of the tomb being hoodwinked, it's a Masonic 3rd degree raising. It's exactly the same as any Mason, any 3rd degree Mason today goes through exactly the same ceremony. And we know that Jesus was a Mason. He was a master Mason. So when we're talking about him being a carpenter, again, this is just it's a joke, really. Yeah. It's an in-joke made by Saul Josephus. The whole of his account of this era is just full of little jokes, and this is one of them. So he wasn't a carpenter. The word in the Greek is a tekton, which is an architect.
Wow. And
all master masons are architects, of course. So Jesus was not a carpenter; he was a master mason. He was a mason from a lodge, from the Judean lodge. And we know that Jesus was a mason because if he was called a tekton in the Greek, not a carpenter. And if you look up tekton today, in the Greek, it means a master mason, a Freemason. That's what it means in the Greek. So when the New Testament is saying that Jesus was a tekton, it's saying he was a Freemason.
Ralph, please tell us that you have the movie rights to this, and that because it's a highly.
Well, can you imagine? Yes, he's coming out with his, square and compass and his little apron and all the rest of it.
Him and George Washington.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten to
Of course.
the census and him born in a manger and such. So
yeah, I'm fascinated. First of all, I would love for you. I'm going to read all of your books. Number one,
right?
I mean, seriously,
you have tons too.
I have learned so much. I wish. Please say you're going to rewrite it in almost a fiction type format, meaning a storytelling format.
I've been trying to do that for decades, and I can't find anyone to do it because I'm going to have to tell you, I'm not a fiction writer. I would write rubbish if it was fiction. No one would read it. I've been trying to get a decent fiction writer. Who likes to do historical novels to actually take this on and do it, because it would be a fascinating story as a fiction. As dry history, it can be very difficult because it's very complex.
It is.
And what you need is a Dan Brown who can translate it into a readable format that is accessible to everybody and makes it interesting. And I think it would be a thumping great story. It really would.
I do too.
All the way from, because I start this all the way from Genesis. I start this with the Garden of Eden, and reinterpret the Garden of Eden all the way through.
Which book is
Joseph.
that? Which book is
Eden
that?
in
That's
Egypt.
Eden in Egypt, because again, it all happened in Egypt.
Okay.
And we know it happened in Egypt because it says. I haven't got the quote in front of me. Anyway, it says. A river came out of the garden. A river came out to water the garden, and from there it was parted into 4 branches. There is only one river in that region that runs through a garden and then is separated into 4 branches, and that's the Nile. It's in black and white. It's screaming at you that this is about the Nile. There is only one river that does that, and that's the Nile. It comes through the garden oasis, which is, the Nile Valley, and then it gets to Giza, and it splits into 4 branches, or it did in antiquity. There are only 2 branches now, but in antiquity there were 4 branches, and those are the 4 branches of the Garden of Eden. And so we know that this is an Egyptian story.
Well, Ralph, we have about 3 minutes left, and I'm going to make this part 1.
Yeah,
I know we're going to have to ask you to get back up at 2 o'clock in the morning again, but this is so fascinating, and I've watched so many interviews that you've done, and every single time I walk away with something new, and every single time I'm more fascinated to learn more about what you've written. I want everybody out there to know that you can go and look at go to Amazon, just type in Ralph Ellis, and it'll bring up pretty much every book that he's written. But you can go to www.edfu-books.com, and that's his website. And I'm going to put you on the spot. Would you promise to come back and do this all over? Because we have Mary Magdalene. We have so many other things to talk about. I wish we had like 3 hours to just sit down and chat with you.
There's 10 books in the series, so it's quite a big series. Yeah, all of the books are available on Adventures Unlimited. You were just talking about Adventures just there. All of the books are on Adventures Unlimited, but they're also obviously all on ebooks now. So, and the ebooks are slightly updated versions. That's sort of the latest versions are on ebook.
And Ralph, in closing, I want to ask you one very quick question, please. Fast forward 100 years from now, you're not on the Earth plane anymore. What is it that you hope your written material does as far as waking up people on the planet? Where do you hope it lands when all is said and done?
Well, I hope we go back to the original religion. I'm not religious, so it doesn't really matter to me very much. But the original religion was Gnostic. It was a Gnostic religion, and that was the religion of Jesus. And Gnosticism changed into, in Latin they call it scientia, and in English we call it science.
Oh, that is a Christian.
If you go to Dan Brown and have a look at his Something and Angels, what was it called? His book?
Angels and Demons.
Yes.
Angels
about the
and
Catholic
Demons.
Church.
That is the battle between church and science. This is what it's all about. Jesus was the scientist. He wasn't. Saul was the church. And it's the same battle that Dan Brown's talking about between Jesus and Saul, the scientist and the religious.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, friend. I am so honored to have you wake up this early.
I know. I'm like, my head's going to blow up.
Eddie's over here, like every time you say something, he's like, "Oh my God."
I know. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. And we're gonna make sure we set this up again because we have, like I said, this is part one of many.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stay tuned.
All right, thank you, and have a great evening. Get some sleep.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph.
so much.
All right, talk to you later.
Thanks a million, Ralph.
All right, guys, it's time for us to get out of here. Again, this is another episode of Truth Be Told with Tony Sweet.
Eddie Connor.
Walt Lusk.
And the next time we're going to be here is September the 26th, 7th? What is it?
26th.
The 26th is the last Friday of the month. We're going to be dealing with the Anunnaki. So it's going to be very fascinating. I think we may have our first guest in studio.
Yay!
Because he's an expert, and I will make sure you check out my website, honorwithtonysweet.com. There's a Truth Be Told page on there that's going to show anybody that's coming up next time and in the future, because in October we're going to have 2 Truth Be Tolds. So I am so honored to have you guys tune in. Sheila, thank you in the chat room for being very fascinated, and maybe next Friday we can ask Eddie, because she's really wanting to know what Eddie thought about Ralph Ellis. And unfortunately we're out of time, but Eddie, Walt, thank you guys so much for another great show.
It's an amazing thrill.
We love you guys, and we'll see you next Wednesday for Honor with Tony Sweet. Tokes Alagundio will be back with us, and then Eddie will be back next week, right?
Yep.
And then you're off to North Carolina.
Yep.
All right. See you then. Talk to you soon.
God bless everyone.
Bye. Yeah.
Bye.
This has been On Air with Tony Sweet. Don't worry, there's more online. Search On Air with Tony Sweet on iTunes for past shows and exclusive behind-the-scenes content. On Air with Tony Sweet every Wednesday and Friday from 4 to 6 p.m. Pacific, right here on UBN Radio.